to view on the website in a few days' time. So if you want to come back and view anything else or watch it all over again because it was so wonderful, please do. It'll be available on our Vimeo account. Okay, so without further ado, let's get started. So we're going to talk about risk priority assessment and its benefits. Okay, so let's start about what is in actual fact a requirement. And a requirement is a criteria which is both functional and non-functional that are relevant to a testing project. So requirements refer to the business requirements that we need to check to ensure that our application is running properly. By weighting our requirements, or in other words, specifying the level of risk and importance of all aspects of our project, we can make sure that we're taking a risk-based approach to testing and lowering the risk that a release of our application will result in losses or in damages. You may have heard of the Pareto principle. The Pareto principle is a rule of thumb that is applicable in many areas and many walks of life. Essentially, it's using it's 80-20, so 80% of something is caused by 20% of something. So to give a few examples, 80% of support issues for a website would cover 20% of the features, or 20% of the population is 80% of the wealth, 20% of websites receive 80% of hits, 80% of all sales are the product of 20% of all of your salesmen. It's a general rule of thumb, so it's not exact. You're never going to find that it is, in fact, exactly 80-20. If we apply the Pareto principle in testing, essentially what we're saying is that 80% of our risk comes from 20% of our application. So if we take a risk-weighted approach, we can prioritize our testing quite easily so that we cover most of the risk. So we can apply test cases to the 20% and cover a very large portion of our risk. Risk levels are calculated using requirements. So linking the test cases and execution lists to the requirements shows the progress and the state of the entire project. One important point to make, therefore, is that no test case should be created that does not cover a requirement. You have a test case, it should be covering a requirement. Okay, over to Sarah.
Okay, so I'm going to be talking to you guys about working effectively in the requirement section. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to split this up. First, tell you about the different objects that we have in the requirement section. So you guys should be familiar with the fact that every section in Tosca has different types of objects. And then after that, I'm just going to go ahead and open up Tosca, and actually we're going to look together at how the requirements section is structured, the different features you have in there, the dashboard, and also how you calculate these weights that Tony kept talking about. And I'll also show you how you link the requirements to the other sections in Tosca. Okay, so as in all other sections in Tosca, there are requirement folders. So these are just structural, organizational elements in the requirement section to help you organize your requirements. So folders could be used, for example, to hold different versions of your application, or different projects within different applications within your project. And requirement sets are then elements that would belong inside the folder, and these represent different views or aspects of an application. So in one requirement folder, you might be setting up the requirements directly related to one version of your application, or one of your applications. And then you'd have various requirement sets, which would represent the different aspects of that application. So in our example, it's the front end or the back end of the application, and each of those would be assigned a requirement set. And inside of the requirement set, you would then structure the actual requirements. So you would have the requirements directly related to the front end of the application and all requirements related to the back end of the application. Depending on which type of approach you take to testing, you can set up the requirements section differently. You can structure it differently. So what you can see on the screen now is the classical development approach. So if you have, let's say, sets of regression tests that you run, and you have then requirements for the overall system, but then you also have different releases before the application is totally launched, and for each release you have different requirements. You can actually structure this so you'd have a requirement set for the overall application and a requirement set for each release, and then the requirements for each of those requirement sets would be structured underneath. So as you can see here, buying a policy, handling a claim, canceling a policy, and provisioning in an insurance application would be included in regression tests. So those would be in the continuous tests for the overall system. But in the first release, we only have to test the buying a policy functionality of the application. And so we can have these structured at the same time and linked to different lists. If you follow an agile development approach, you can also set up the requirements to reflect that. So in the exact same example with an insurance application, you can see that you can have different epics set up in your regression tests. So each requirement here would represent a different epic, and you would have a requirement set for each sprint, and each requirement for those sprints would be your user stories. So in sprint 2, you would cover, as a role, I want to be able to buy a life insurance policy, etc. Okay, so again, you can really structure the requirements to reflect the type of testing that you do. Okay, so now we're going to cover weighting requirements, and in order to do this, I'm going to just jump right into Tosca. I think that's probably the most efficient way to do this. So, all right. So here you can see I'm in Tosca 10.0. So if you're using an older version, this might look a little bit graphically different, but the sections, at least the requirements section, should function primarily the same. Here you can see that we have a requirements folder. So this is the root folder for the requirements section. And we've created a requirement folder for the web shop. So all requirements directly related to the application go in here. And then, as I said, we have different sets for the back end and the front end of the application. If I expand the front end requirement set, you can see that I now have four different requirements. So main requirements directly associated to the front end of the web shop. So customer tasks, handling products, shopping cart processes, and order process are the four main requirements that are associated with the front end. So these are the core processes of the application. But this is a really broad definition of the requirements for the application. So actually in Tosca, you can create sub-requirements. Okay, so under each of these requirements, I have now sub-requirements which help me to specify each of these larger requirements. Adding requirements, you simply just right-click on either the requirement where you want to create a sub-requirement or the requirement set and select Create Requirement. Okay, so as you saw in the presentation earlier, requirement sets are orange and the requirements themselves are white squares. Okay, so here we have, again, all of our main requirements and the sub-requirements. And you'll also notice that at the moment, I have two columns open, frequency class and damage class. Okay, so what are these two columns? What are the numbers that you see here? These two columns are used to calculate the weight of each requirement. These would be numbers, so the frequency class and the damage class for a requirement would actually come from business analysts, and what they should tell you is how frequently a specific requirement is used in your application and the level of risk or impact associated with that requirement. In the requirement section, both of these classes can be ranked from 0 to 1. So you can have numbers ranging from 0 to 1 in these columns. Sorry, 0 to 10. I said 0 to 1. I meant 0 to 10. 10 being the highest, so the most frequently used, and the most damage or risk associated, and 0 meaning none. So the lower you go, the less frequent or the less impact is associated. So the frequency of a requirement is how often is this requirement expected to be used in the application. You can see here that we've actually used a ranking system, a rating system from 1 to 5. So even though you can actually input numbers from 0 to 10, you can adjust this range according to your business needs. So we have chosen a range of 1 to 5. For example, here you can see that compare products has a frequency class of 1. This means that the compare products feature in the web shop is expected to be used extremely infrequently, so it's rarely used. Okay? Versus, for example, the login process. The login process of the web shop, which has a frequency class of 5. And this means that we expect the login to be used, or the login feature to be used very frequently. Okay? And again, these numbers should really come from business analysts, and we're not comparing them, so we're not comparing login to compare products. Each one of these is standalone. How frequently is it used on a scale of 1 to 5? The damage class is, as I said, the level of risk or financial impact associated with this requirement. So the higher the damage class, for example, add products here has a damage class of 5. That means that there's a huge financial impact if add products does not work. Versus, again, let's look at, say, search for products. Search for products has a damage class of only 2. So we can assume that the damage associated with search for products not working is much lower. Okay? So, and looking at the frequency and the damage, for example, with search products, we can see that it's used frequently, so it's got a level of 4 for frequency. So it is something that customers will do. They will search for products in the web shop, but the level of risk associated if they can't search properly is much lower. Versus if our customers can't add products, then they can't buy anything, and the financial risk associated with customers not being able to buy anything is obviously much higher. Okay. To add numbers in here, you simply just manually add them in. Okay, so I'm just going to add a couple numbers here to simulate different frequency and damage classes for each of these different requirements and sub-requirements. Okay, so I'm just typing these in, that's it. And you can see, for example, that in the payments method and the calculate shipping costs, Both the damage class and frequency class are very high, so they're extremely frequently used and have a very high risk if they don't function, versus, let's say, the reorder process, which has a much lower frequency of use and a slightly lower financial risk associated. Okay, I can now look at the difference between these requirements all on the same level or the sub-requirements of each of these made larger parent requirements. Okay? So what's the point of putting in the frequency class or the damage class? Well, as Tony said, we want to prioritize our risk testing. So we want to make sure that we're covering the most amount of risk as we can. As all of you know, if you're doing testing right now, it's very difficult to cover 100% of the risk with your test cases, if not in some projects impossible. So you have to try to cover as much as you can. So our philosophy is that by weighting the requirements, you're able to find the highest level of risk, so which requirements are the most important, and test those first so that those that have less of an impact from a business perspective maybe will be covered, but later, after the most important requirements are covered. So where does that weight come from? I'm going to go ahead and add another column called weight. Just like in all other sections of TSCA, I right-click on the column header row here, and I select column chooser. So it's just right-click and column chooser. And I get this little dialog box which allows me to select from pre-designated columns that can appear in the requirement section. And I'm going to go to the bottom and I'm going to double-click on weight. Okay. So what you can see here is that a weight has been assigned to each requirement. This weight is calculated according to the frequency class and the damage class that has been assigned to those requirements. So immediately you can kind of see that compare products, which we saw before, has the lowest frequency class and the lowest damage class, also has the lowest weight, versus calculate shipping costs, which has the highest frequency class and the highest damage class, and it was also given the highest weight. Some of you who are good at math might have already realized where this calculation is coming from. What it's doing is it's actually exponentially creating the weight according to the frequency class and damage class with a base of 2. So the actual calculation here is 2 to the power of the damage class times 2 to the power of the frequency class. Okay? And so what this means is that as one of the classes goes up, damage or frequency, then the weight is exponentially increased. So at the moment, they're both weighted equally. If I wanted to change the, let's say, weight associated to the damage class because I think that the financial impact of a requirement is more important than the damage class, for example, I do have the possibility to change the weight manually or to change the calculation base value. To manually override the weight, I can simply type it in. So if I, for example, thought compare products should have a higher weight, I can manually override that number. I can also, as I said, if I want to change the weight associated with just one of these classes, I can go to the Properties tab of the requirement set. So I'm on the requirement set, I go to Properties, and here I can change the base value for the damage class and the frequency class. And as I said, they're both by default set to 2, but I can adjust this. So if I would want the damage class to have a higher impact on the weight, I could change it manually to 3. Okay, and then you would see on the details tab that every requirement with a high damage class is now exponentially larger even. Okay, so that the damage class now impacts the weight even more. And now with this weight, I'm able to see which requirements in the web shop have the highest impact on our application, and that's where I would start testing. So I could go ahead and I could look just at the 4 requirements I have here, and I can see that the shopping cart and the order process have a much higher risk-based weight than customer tasks or handled products. So I would want to start the focus of my testing on the shopping cart or the order process. Okay? It's not that customer tasks and handled products aren't important, but from a risk-based business perspective, shopping cart and order process have a higher weight. And so I would start testing there because I will be covering more of the risk of the application. Then if I would expand these sub-requirements, I can also look at which inside of these have the highest weight and the most importance. And I can see that actually calculate shipping costs and payment method actually have the highest weight in shopping cart or order process. So I would want to focus and begin my testing with test cases directly associated to the calculate shipping costs and the payment methods requirement. Okay? Let's take a look at a couple more useful columns in the requirements section. So once again, I'll right-click and go to column chooser. And I'm going to want the coverage specified percentage column, as well as the relative weight, the contribution percentage, and the coverage executed, or sorry, execution state. There we go. Okay, I'll just move these around. Okay, so let's look first at the relative weight. The relative weight and the contribution percentage at first glance look identical. If I'm only looking at the 4 main parent requirements, then the relative weight and the contribution percentage are the same because each of these, according to its weight, contributes some amount of risk to the overall front end of the application, so to the entire requirement set. So for example, if we cover shopping cart, we're already covering 46% of the overall front end of the application. If we expand to see the sub-requirements, we'll see that there's a slight difference in the contribution percentage. So for example, if I look over here at the order process sub-requirements, you'll see that the relative weight actually adds up to 100 over here. Okay, so the relative weight shows the weighting of each requirement relative to all other requirements on the same hierarchical level. So calculate shipping costs accounts for 41.4% of the order process requirement. It has nothing to do with its weight according to the whole web shop front end, just according to its weight. It's just its weight according to the order process. So relative to execute checkout, billing address, payment methods, and reorder. The contribution percentage actually shows us the contribution to the entire front end of the application. Okay, so this, you'll notice, does not add up to 100, but rather adds up to 45.57. Okay, so calculate shipping costs covers 42% of the order process, but only 19% of the whole web shop front end. And so if I were to expand all of the requirements, then it would be the contribution percentages on the sub-requirement level that would add up to 100. See if I'm selecting that correctly. There we go. Okay. And you can again see that by covering calculate shipping costs and payment methods, we're already covering about 36–37% of the whole application just by covering 2 requirements. Okay? And by covering the order process, we're already covering about 46% of the risk of the entire application. So about almost half of the entire application. Okay, so this is why we do the weight and we use the risk-based assessment approach so that we can try, if we are going to spend time designing test cases, we can try to cover the requirements with the highest level of risk before release of the application. Okay, so now we have also a couple additional columns that you can see here, coverage specified and execution state. So I'm going to explain to you really quickly what you see here, what that kind of dashboard means, and then I'll also explain to you how to link the requirements to the different sections. Okay. The coverage specified section here is either white or kind of yellow. You might think that it's difficult here to distinguish between 100% coverage specified white or 100% coverage specified yellow. The white actually means that it's 100% unspecified, okay? So that means that it's not yet been specified. So no test cases have been designed that are directly related to this requirement, versus 100% yellow, meaning 100% has been specified in the test case section. Okay? If you are familiar with the test case section, then you know that test cases can be either planned, in work, or completed. So for a single requirement, let's say for I don't know, shipping costs, right now no test cases have been linked to this requirement. So as far as TSCA is concerned, 0% of the calculate shipping costs requirements have been covered. As soon as there are test cases that are planned and linked to this requirement, that number will go up to 20, or the unspecified will go to 80, and the coverage specified will go up to 20. Okay, so planned test cases account for 20% coverage. When those test cases go from planned to in-work, so we have planned the test cases, now we want to work on them, so we set the work state to in-work, then that specified number shifts to 50. So planned linked test cases are 20%, built linked test cases are 50%, and when we set the test case work state to completed, then the coverage specified will be 100%, and that will be the yellow bar. Okay? And that will be for each sub-requirement, and the main requirement coverage is calculated according to the coverage specified of its sub-requirements times its weight. Okay? So the order process is only a small fraction specified, so it's a tiny, like 2% specified, and that comes from the reorder process being 100% specified, but it only accounts for 1.7% of the order process. The order process at the moment is only 2% covered. In the execution state column, the coloring is a little bit different. So the gray means that nothing has been yet linked to any execution lists. White means that they have been linked but not yet been run. Green means tests that have been run and have passed. And red means test cases that have been run and failed. Okay, so one more time. Gray means that there are no test cases yet linked to an execution list. White means that they are linked but have not yet been run. Green means that they are linked and have been run and have passed, and red means they are linked, have been run, and have failed. Okay, so the requirements section now gives you a really good overview of the status of the entire project, of the amount of coverage, of the overall application that you have right now. So we can see we've covered 9% of the overall application, and we've also executed about 9% of the test cases as well. 8% passed, 1% failed. So you really get a good idea kind of how the whole project is proceeding. Now I just want to discuss how you would link things to the requirements section, because you can see here the dashboard works really well if everything's linked. So there's going to be a bit of moving around of the different sections on the screen, so I'll try to go slowly so that you can follow me, okay? So the first linking that should be done if you're using the entire test suite. So if you're using test case design, the first link that you should create would be between the test case design and the requirements section. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to set up my workspace so that I can see the test case design section and the requirements section simultaneously. So what you can see here is I have 3 test cases associated to a test sheet. These all belong to the requirement calculate shipping costs. Okay. So if you're using the whole test suite, if you are using test case design, then the first link that you'll want to make is to link these 3 test cases to the requirement. Okay. So I would link all 3 of these test cases to the calculate shipping costs requirement. Okay. What does this tell me? You can see now that Tosca has alerted me with these little symbols here that test cases have now been designed. So we have this little test case symbol with the red kind of ribbon on it. These are test case replacement icons, and these alert me that test cases have been designed, but still have yet to be built or executed. Okay, but they're kind of now placeholders that say, according to my design, I need 3 test cases to cover calculate shipping costs. Okay, and you can also see now that I have planned these test cases. So just expand this a little bit more. I have planned 3 test cases for calculate shipping costs, and now this corresponds to 20% coverage specified. Okay, and also I now know that there are 20% of the tests kind of planned, but nothing yet has been executed. Okay. The next link that I would have to do would be to link my test cases to my requirements. So of course, if I was working in the entire suite, I would have linked test case design to the test cases, to a template to create all my different instances of test cases. If this is something you're not familiar with, then hopefully we'll get the chance to cover this in a future MOOC for you guys to talk about the test case design section and linking it to test cases. So I don't want to get too into it, but if you had linked the test case design, so these 3 test cases, to the test case section, to the template, you would end up now with 3 real built test cases, okay? So now I have to link those test cases to the requirements so that Tosca knows that I've now built them. Okay, so step 1 was I've designed test cases. I linked the designed test cases to the requirements. Now step 2 with regards to linking to requirements would be to link the test cases to the requirements. Okay, so once again, I get both of those sections open. And I simply link all 3 of these test cases to the requirement. And because the test sheet, the test case design and the test cases were linked, Tosca automatically realizes that they're the same test cases. Now they've been built, and so they update with the little blue ribbon saying not only have I designed these test cases, but I've built them, and now hopefully they're ready for execution. So these were already set to complete. If you don't believe me, I can show you over here. So they have the work set to completed, and therefore my coverage went right up to 100. Okay? And now the final step. So first was test case design to requirements. Second is now test cases to requirements. The final step is, of course, that I've put my test cases in the execution list section. I'm running my executions. I'm ready with my executions. And I have to link also the execution lists to the requirements. Okay? And this is how I'll get the overall view, the status of the project. So here I have an empty execution list, so I'll go ahead and I'll drop my test cases in there. I'll go ahead and drop all 3 of my test cases in the execution list. Okay. Now I have test case 1, test case 2, test case 3 in an execution list. I'm not going to run those for you, so I'll go ahead and I'll manually set a result. So let's say 1 is passed, 1 has failed. So assume that I've now run all these executions of the test case, and let's say 1 I haven't yet run. Okay, so it's still no result. In the execution section, I get this information, but it's not only here. I can also now, because they're linked, or I can also link it now to the requirement section, and it will update. So unlike in the other sections, I'm not going to be linking directly to the calculate shipping cost requirement. Instead, I will link this entire test sheet, execution list, sorry, to the entire requirement set. And the reason I link it to the whole set is because an execution list doesn't necessarily have to include test cases just related to one requirement. I could have multiple requirements included in an execution list, but because everything's already linked, Tosca recognizes where those linked test cases belong, under which requirements, and it finds them and it fills in the information. So it will see test case 1, test case 2, test case 3, corresponds to test case 1, test case 2, test case 3, and it will update all of the results. Okay, so I'll go ahead and do that for you now. Execution list to requirements set. And there you go. Now for the calculate shipping cost requirement, the test cases have been updated to show the execution status, passed, failed, or not yet run. And the execution state is also updated to show that 33% of the calculate shipping cost requirement is passed, 33% is failed, and 33% has yet to be executed. These results are reflected on the higher level, okay? So they also update on the parent requirement, where I can see that 43% of the requirements has been covered by the different sections in Tosca, so being built and designed and built. And I can also see that about 30% of the application has been executed so far, 14% passing, of the order process has been executed, 14% passed, 16% failed, 14% not run, and 57% still totally unspecified, and that comes from execute checkout, billing address, and payment methods. Okay, so part of this, these numbers as well come from the reorder, which has, as you can see, been specified. That was about 2% coverage. Okay. And on the highest level, so on the requirement set for the overall front end of the application, I can also now see the coverage specified and execution state have updated as well. Okay, so by covering just a couple of the requirements here, I've already covered a pretty large percentage of, so almost a third of the application itself. Okay. Okay, great. So I'm going to now hand it back over to Tony, and then we'll go ahead and answer your questions if there are any.
Okay, so thank you very much, Sarah. A wonderfully explained section there. Just a quick reminder, we have got Frank sat here waiting to answer your questions. He doesn't have much to do, generally, so it's the highlight of his week sitting here answering your questions. So please throw them in, and let's keep him busy because he gets lonely otherwise. So please send us your questions so that we can quickly answer them. What I'm going to quickly do now, before we start the questions, is do a very quick recap of a few issues, a few areas. Whoops. So hang on 1 second as I make a mess of things. Hang on, there we go. Excuse me. What I want to do is let's have a quick recap of some of the key areas and some of the key processes, because we talked about a lot there. There was a lot of information there. In actual fact, if you get down to the main key points, really quite simple. So if you want to weight the requirements, very, very simple process. Number one, you select the requirement structure that you wish to weight. Number two, make sure that you have the damage class and frequency class columns visible in the section so you can actually do it. Then next step you're going to do is you're going to assign the damage class to each requirement. So potential damage. Then number four, assign the frequency class to each requirement and complete that for all subordinate levels. All requirements require this, so you need to do it all the way through. The other thing we'll talk about, what should be linked to the requirements. So what are you actually linking? So if you're using it, if you're using test case design, the test sheet should be linked to the requirement. Your test case, all your test cases should be linked to requirement. There shouldn't be a test case created that hasn't got a corresponding requirement. And finally, the execution list should be linked to the requirement set. So that's execution lists to requirement sets. Okay, so hopefully we have some questions.
Yes, we do. Okay, thank you all for posing your questions. I'm going to answer a couple of them. Some I already answered directly. Those are the ones that are very specific for specific needs, but the general questions I will answer now and completely. Also, thank you, Sarah, for explaining everything so well, and thank you, Tony, for introducing me so greatly. Okay, question number one I want to answer is, what options do we have to actually describe the requirements a bit more? Can we only use the name of the requirement? No, we cannot only use the name. We also can get the column description into our requirement section and can enter basically everything we want in here and can describe the requirements in detail as we need. And we can also add some attachments, so text files, which is sometimes done, so you can actually describe your requirements as detailed as you need them to be described. Additionally, how flexible is Tosca in handling and changing the requirement section? How flexible are we with changing system requirements? That depends on how you set up your requirement section. Sarah briefly explained the differences in requirement section used in waterfall projects or in agile projects. Since waterfall projects are per definition not that flexible and not that many changes apply, you can go very deeply in your requirement structure here. If you need your requirements to be flexible and easy to adapt, don't go that deep. Take your requirement set, 1, 2, 3 levels of requirements, and that's it. And so you can adapt it easily. If you make very detailed structures like 7 or 8 levels deep, flexibility gets lost, and you will probably have big problems when you work agile. Another question is, can you show the import from Excel to the requirement section? Yes, I can briefly show that to you. I will just open Excel here on the computer. As you see, that's an empty Excel sheet. I will just create a quick requirement structure. Let's say I have here customer tasks, and in the next level, login, modify data, and registration. So you see, I put column A is my high-level requirement and column B are my leaf requirements. I could do the same thing for additional requirements. Just to give you a brief show of that, addresses and shopping cart. The requirements do not necessarily make that much sense the way. I want just to show you how you can import them. Actually, it's just a copy and paste. I copy those requirements, I mark them, press Ctrl C. You see they are now in my clipboard. Go back to my requirement section in Tosca, create a new requirement set, right click on it, create requirement structure from clipboard, and there we are. Exactly what I just created in Excel has now been imported to Tosca. And so you can see it's not necessary that the testers who work with Tosca all day do actually create the requirements. Your business department could create the requirements easily in Excel, and you can just copy and paste them into Tosca. Another questions we have is regarding what Sarah told you about the damage base value and the frequency base value. Should you use that often? Should you use it regularly? No, you should not. Damage base value, frequency base value on 2 is what works in 99.9% of the projects and requirement set. This is something you should only change when it's absolutely necessary, when damage class or frequency class are way, way more important than the other one. But believe me, in 99% of your projects, 2 and 2 are perfectly fine and should not be changed. Also, what Sarah showed you with changing the weight after you did frequency class and damage class is something that is possible, that you can do, that it's nothing that will influence Tosca in a bad way, but it's something that should be rarely used. Normally, frequency class and damage class, you do that, and that's the way to go. Just keep in mind, if you work closely together with the business department, especially if you have several business departments involved, everybody will think their features are the most important ones. So you have to rein them in a bit and make sure that you really get weighted requirements. Otherwise, everything will have 5 and 5 everywhere, and you could have just skipped the last 2 hours. Yeah, a very important question. Thank you for that. How much benefit, what benefit is lost if you're using Tosca but not using the requirements? Well, the benefit of actually seeing how much you've tested according to your risk. Imagine you're not doing risk assessment. Imagine you don't use requirement and you just use execution lists. So what do I have? I have 50 test cases. I run 50 test cases. 49 of those pass and 1 fails. Yoo-hoo, I can go live because it's only one single problem I have. That's not a big deal. So yeah, if I use the requirements, well, that single test case that failed might be my most important test case. That's my basic feature. Without, my whole system will not work for the customers. That's something I cannot see with one glance in only the execution list section. I need a weighted, risk-assessed requirement section to actually be able to see that a single test case can screw up my whole system and prevent me from going live. That's the big benefit I get here, and that's the big benefit I lose when I'm not using that. I cannot see on one glance that even 1 or 2 failed test cases can screw up everything. Or in the opposite way, 25% of my test cases fail, of my raw number test cases. But all of them are so minor in their impact that even with half of my test cases failed, I can still go live because altogether they maybe 1% of my system or 0.5% of my system. So it takes you the ability to decide, is your system ready to go live or not, without having to look in detail in every single test case that passed or failed. You can see it on one glance, is my system ready? Okay, what else do we have? What requirements tools does Tosca integrate with? Basically about everything. You can use Jira, you can use HPLM for that. We've got open APIs, so you can integrate with basically every requirements tool that's around. If it doesn't work out of the box, we can customize that. So basically Tosca can work together with all tools. We can integrate with everything there. We're working on making it convenient as possible. Don't forget, Tosca is not a requirements management tool. The requirements in Tosca are for doing the risk assessment of your test. We're not there to manage your requirements. Tools like Jira do that way better. But we integrate with Jira very nicely, very closely. So that's always good to know that if you only hold your requirements in Tosca, you're missing out on something. We got a question about the agile requirements. Again, that's something Sarah talked about nicely before. Make sure if you're not clear, look again at the webinar's video, because that will clear that up. If not, you can always ask our support or maybe get our methodology department to help you setting up your requirements there, your epics, your user stories. That's basically requirement set could be an epic and requirement can be user story, and then you're all good to go. And yeah, that's all the questions we're going to answer now. Wait, there's one more that I will let Tony answer, because it is there a way to get a recording of this webinar?
Yes, there is, and we will cover that right now. Okay, so thank you very much, Frank, and thank you again, Sarah. We have, I think, they have both brilliantly demonstrated the power of Tosca, once again, and specifically the power of the requirements structure, the requirements section within Tosca, and just how fantastic Tosca is, as always. So let's start with next week. Next week we're going to move on to another webinar, again hosted by myself and Sarah. We're going to talk about dynamic expressions and execution lists. So we're going to close the circle of Tosca. We've started at the beginning, we've gone round the testing cycle, and we'll sort of look at dynamic expressions, execution lists, so that you can see what it is, what the whole process is and will be. That will be next Wednesday, November the 23rd, between 2 and 3 Central European time. So please, we'd love to have you here to join us again. You can view, we'll touch again on what Frank said. Do you need more help? Because if you do, we are here for you. You can contact support for questions at support@tricentis.com. You can contact us at the training team, academy@tricentis.com. We love to hear from people. You can also contact and look at our fantastic knowledge base. The knowledge base contains lots and lots of articles on how to do things and how to complete things, and there are forums, and there is advice, and there is help. If you need some information, it will be there. And of course, there are our fantastic online manuals, really, really excellent, completely covering everything you need to know on Tosca with your manuals. You can also like us on Facebook. You can link with us on LinkedIn, and you can tweet us or see our tweets on Twitter. There's a wealth of information there. It's not just about Tosca, about the widening testing community, and articles, invitations to other pages that might be useful to you, and so on and so forth. It's not just about us. There we will link you to other parts of the community. And how do you view our videos? Well, in the invitation you received for this webinar and the invitation that you have received for next week's webinar, you will find that there are links to the previous videos. They're hosted on Vimeo. We have a Tricentis Vimeo page where you can access them. I don't have the link here, but as I said, they are within your invites to the webinars, both for this week's and for next week's. You can always, if you need more information on that, send training itself at Academy. Send us an email at academy@tricentis.com. We'll be able to send you the link directly. Plus, what we intend to do at the end of these MOOCs is we will send out an email to all of you that have attended and all of you that have registered, and we will include links to all of the videos there so you can see them again. So I would like to say a final thank you to both Frank and Sarah for their wonderful input, and thank you again to you guys for attending and listening to us. Please, 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 please do complete the feedback that you get at the end of this webinar. We will be doing these again, we hope, and what we need to know is what you think of them, how we can improve them, what topics particularly you want us to cover. The next ones, we will be basing the next topics and the next series of these MOOCs around what you want. So tell us what you want, what you really, really want, and we will do it. So thank you very, very much, and look forward to speaking to you all next week. So goodbye from Vienna.